Did you hear about Karl Marx? Who was he? Where he was born and what he did? If you know, then you are really a historical book lover. If not, it's okay. Give me just 15 minutes from your valuable time so that I can explain his life history in short. Firstly, Karl Marx, famous for philosopher, economist, historian, sociologist, political theorist, journalist, and revolutionary socialist. He is best known as the author of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, two works that laid the foundations for Marxism, a theory that has profoundly influenced political thought, economics, and history. Now his life history begins. Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in Trier, in the Prussian Rhineland, now in Germany. His family was of Jewish origin, though his father, Heinrich Marx, converted to Lutheranism to avoid the anti-Semitic restrictions in Prussia. Heinrich was a lawyer, and his mother, Henrietta Pressburg, came from a wealthy family. Marx grew up in a comfortable middle-class environment, but his early exposure to Enlightenment thought and Prussian politics made him aware of the conflicts between economic power and social justice. Marx was an excellent student, and his father encouraged his intellectual pursuits. He studied at the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium in Trier, where he became interested in philosophy and literature. His exposure to Romanticism and the early German idealists, such as Kant and Hegel, deeply influenced him, though he would later critique their ideas. In 1835, Marx enrolled at the University of Bonn to study law, as his father wanted him to pursue a career in legal practice. However, Marx was more interested in philosophy and literature. He spent much of his time reading, attending student clubs, and getting involved in various intellectual and social circles. Marx's passion for literature led to conflict with his father, and after a year, Heinrich Marx insisted that Karl transfer to the more disciplined and prestigious University of Berlin. At the University of Berlin, Marx's intellectual horizons broadened significantly. He joined a circle of radical thinkers known as the Young Hegelians, who were critical of the conservative Prussian state and traditional religion. Marx was particularly influenced by the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Although Hegel had passed away a few years earlier, his ideas dominated the intellectual climate of Berlin. Hegel's dialectical method, which posited that history and human development were driven by contradictions and their resolution, captivated Marx. However, Marx would later move away from Hegel's idealism and develop his own materialist interpretation of history, known as historical materialism. In 1841, Marx completed his doctoral thesis, The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. His thesis was a relatively obscure piece of work focused on ancient Greek philosophy, but it demonstrated his deep engagement with philosophical ideas. Marx was unable to secure a teaching position due to his radical views, and instead, he turned to journalism. In 1842, Marx became the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper in Cologne. Under his leadership, the newspaper became a platform for radical critiques of the Prussian government and the capitalist system. Marx wrote about social issues, censorship, and political economy, and his writings began to attract the attention of the Prussian authorities. His time at the Rheinische Zeitung was short-lived, however. The Prussian government, alarmed by the increasingly radical tone of the newspaper, suppressed it in 1843. Marx moved to Paris, the center of radical political thought at the time, where he met other revolutionary thinkers, including Friedrich Engels, who would become his lifelong collaborator. In Paris, Marx immersed himself in the vibrant intellectual and political scene. He met Friedrich Engels in 1844, and the two quickly developed a close friendship. Engels had been writing on similar topics, particularly the conditions of the working class in England, and the two found common ground in their critique of capitalism. Together, they began developing the theory that would later be known as Marxism. Marx's engagement with political economy deepened, and he started reading works by economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and others. This period marked the beginning of his development of a materialist understanding of history, which would later become the core of his philosophy. In 1844, Marx wrote the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, in which he explored concepts such as alienation, human labor, and the nature of capital. He argued that under capitalism, workers were alienated from the products of their labor, from the process of labor itself, from their fellow workers, and from their own potential as human beings. Marx's concept of alienation was deeply influenced by his engagement with Hegelian philosophy, but it represented a shift towards a materialist critique of the capitalist system. In 1845, Marx and Engels co-authored The German Ideology, a work in which they outlined the theory of historical materialism for the first time. According to this theory, the material conditions of society, i.e., the mode of production, determine its social, political, and intellectual life. They argued that history is a series of class struggles between those who own the means of production and those who do not. Marx's political activities in Paris soon attracted the attention of the French authorities, and in 1845, he was expelled from the country. He moved to Brussels, where he continued his work with Engels and became more involved in revolutionary political organizations. In 1847, Marx and Engels joined the Communist League, an international political organization dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a socialist society. They were commissioned to write a manifesto for the organization, which they completed in early 1848. The Communist Manifesto, published in February 1848, is one of the most famous political documents in history. In it, Marx and Engels argued that all of human history is the history of class struggles. They predicted that the contradictions inherent in the capitalist system would eventually lead to its collapse and the rise of a classless, communist society. The manifesto ends with the famous call, "Workers of the world, unite." The manifesto was published just as revolutionary uprisings were breaking out across Europe. In 1848, revolution swept through France, Germany, Italy, and the Austrian Empire, driven by economic hardship, demands for political reforms, and growing discontent with the existing monarchies. Marx returned to Germany to participate in the revolution there, hoping that the revolutionary wave would lead to the establishment of a socialist society. However, the revolutions of 1848 ultimately failed, and Marx, like many other radicals, was forced into exile. He settled in London, where he would spend the rest of his life. Marx's life in London was marked by personal hardship and intellectual achievement. He lived in poverty for much of this time, relying on financial support from Engels, who had inherited money from his family's textile business. Despite the difficulties, Marx continued his political and intellectual work. During the 1850s and 1860s, Marx spent much of his time researching and writing about political economy. He studied the workings of the capitalist system in great detail, focusing on how capital is accumulated, how profits are generated, and how labor is exploited. His research culminated in the publication of the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867. Das Kapital is Marx's magnum opus, and it offers a comprehensive critique of capitalism. In the book, Marx explains how capitalism functions as a system of exploitation, in which the owners of capital extract surplus value from the labor of workers. He also analyzes the dynamics of capital accumulation, the concentration of wealth, and the tendency of capitalism towards crises. Though Das Kapital was not widely read during Marx's lifetime, it would later become one of the most influential works in economic and political thought. Marx continued to write and work on subsequent volumes of Das Kapital after 1867, though his health was in decline. He was also involved in political activism, particularly through his association with the International Workingmen's Association, the First International, which he helped found in 1864. The First International aimed to unite workers across Europe in the struggle for socialism. Marx's later years were marked by illness and personal tragedy. His wife, Jenny, died in 1881, and Marx himself became increasingly sick. Despite these challenges, Marx continued to work on his theoretical ideas, though he was unable to complete the remaining volumes of Das Kapital before his death. Karl Marx died on March 14, 1883, in London. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery, where his grave has since become a site of pilgrimage for socialists and others inspired by his ideas. Karl Marx's ideas have had an enormous impact on the modern world. His critique of capitalism inspired many political movements, including the labor movement, socialism, and communism. In the 20th century, Marx's ideas were adapted by political leaders such as Vladimir Lenin, Mao Zedong, and others, who sought to implement Marxist principles through revolutionary means. Marx's influence extends far beyond politics. His ideas have shaped the fields of sociology, economics, philosophy, and history. Terms like class struggle, alienation, and surplus value have become central concepts in the study of society and economics. Despite the collapse of many Marxist-inspired regimes in the late 20th century, Marx's critique of capitalism remains relevant in contemporary discussions on economic inequality, globalization, labor exploitation, and class struggle. His ideas continue to be studied and debated in academic, political, and social movements worldwide. In essence, Karl Marx's legacy is one of profound influence. While his vision of a classless, communist society has not come to fruition in the way he envisioned, his analysis of capitalism and its contradictions continues to shape modern thought. His work remains a powerful critique of the systems of power and economics that govern the world, and his ideas continue to inspire those who seek alternatives to the inequalities and injustices of capitalist societies. Lastly, in this way he became one of the famous advocates of communism and political philosopher. Now my friends, you know who was Karl Marx, what he did and why he was famous for, and I would like to thank you my friends for giving your valuable time as well as subscribing my channel for supporting me. Now let's take a goodbye and again meet in another interesting character of another historical people.